I remember the moment our war stopped being a war and became a clerical error. It was not marked by an explosion or a charge, or the sound of screaming shells tearing the sky apart. It came quietly, in the form of a supply docket stamped, pending, in red ink that never dried properly. I noticed it because I was the one responsible for reconciling the paperwork at the trench level command dugout, a half-flooded hole reinforced with rusted plasteel and prayer strips nailed into the walls. The stamp looked ordinary. That was the problem. Everything that doomed us looked ordinary. The docket sat in its tray for 3 days. Then 5. Then long enough that the edges curled from damp air and trench mist. Each cycle, I carried it forward with the rest of the documents, expecting it to be countersigned, forwarded, resolved. Each cycle it came back to me unchanged. No rejection, no approval. Just waiting, supply delay. The adjutant said without looking up, "Log it and move on." So I logged it. The Vox lines stayed quiet. Not dead. Dead lines hiss and crackle and announce their failure. Ours were worse. They were clean, silent, perfectly operational, according to every diagnostic prayer and machine, right performed by the comms crew. We transmitted situation reports at the scheduled intervals, using approved phrasing and format, enemy contact levels, ammunition expenditure, casualty estimates, environmental conditions, requests for resupply. We received nothing in return. At first, that wasn't unusual. High command was distant, stretched thin across a dozen fronts. Silence happened. You learned to wait. You learned to trust that someone, somewhere, had seen your report and stamped it into a larger plan you were not permitted to understand. We were ordered to hold position until further notice, those exact words. They were read aloud by the regimental officer under a flapping tarp that passed for a command canopy, his voice steady despite the mud sucking at our boots and the distant thunder of a war that was clearly still happening somewhere else. Hold position. Await further notice. Maintain readiness. Further notice never came. The hours stretched, then the days. The trenches filled with the smells that only stagnant warfare produces: wet earth, burned propellant residue, unwashed bodies packed too tightly into too little space, rot set into everything, wooden supports, ration crates, the hems of uniforms that never fully dried. Lice became a given. Infection became routine. Still, discipline held because discipline was all we had. I kept filing reports, every morning cycle, whatever morning meant under a sky permanently choked with ash. I filled out the same forms. Position unchanged. Enemy activity minimal. Morale stable. The words felt dishonest, but honesty was not part of the form. Accuracy was optional. Compliance was mandatory. On the 4th cycle, without reply, someone asked the question out loud. "Sir," a trooper said during weapons maintenance, his voice low and careful. "Are we still on the list?" The officer stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Of course we are," he said. "Don't be stupid." But I saw his hand tighten around his sidearm as he said it. By the end of the first week, the artillery behind us fell silent. Not all at once. One battery stopped firing, then another. The distant thud of friendly guns faded into memory, replaced by an emptiness that pressed on the ears. We were still in enemy territory. Scouting patrols confirmed movement, lights flickering at night, shapes shifting in the ruins beyond the wire. But the great machine of war had rolled onward without us. We were no longer advancing. We were no longer retreating. We were simply present. The trenches we occupied had been built for a push that never came. They were too shallow, too exposed, hastily reinforced. Rain pooled in them until our boots rotted. Men developed trench coughs that never quite went away. The medici did what they could with dwindling supplies, logging every treatment with the same clinical detachment as always. Acceptable conditions. One report read. I remember staring at that line for a long time before stamping it. The silence from command began to feel deliberate, not hostile, not malicious, just indifferent. That was worse. Every institution teaches you to fear active punishment. Few prepare you for neglect. Neglect has no sound, no shape, no single enemy you can curse. It is simply the absence of acknowledgement, and in the Imperium, acknowledgement is life. We started checking the Vox obsessively. Every flicker of static made heads snap up. Every distant signal caused a ripple of hope that died just as quickly. Once, late in a cycle when exhaustion made fools of us all, A corrupted echo bounced back one of our own transmissions, delayed and distorted. A trooper wept openly, convinced it was a reply. It took a full minute to convince him otherwise. I began to understand something then, something no training manual ever explains. You can be executed without a bullet. No order comes down declaring you traitors. No firing squad assembles. No public denunciation cleans the ledger. Instead, you are simply omitted. A line item left unresolved. A unit that remains, pending, long enough that someone, somewhere, assumes it has already been dealt with. I imagined a clerk far away, surrounded by stacks of parchment and cogitator screens, glancing at our designation and deciding, without malice, that it no longer required attention. There are always more urgent matters, always another front, always another request. We became background noise. The officer ordered us to maintain routines, weapon drills, watch rotations, prayer assemblies. It was easier to pretend the war was merely paused for us, that resupply would come any cycle now. Faith was invoked constantly, not with comfort, but with threat. Doubt was framed as weakness, weakness as contagion. I kept my head down and my pen moving. Every document I stamped felt heavier than the last. The ink bled slightly on the damp paper, spreading like a bruise. Somewhere deep in my gut, a realization took root. If this continued, there would be no dramatic end. No last stand worth recording. Just attrition, confusion, and eventually silence. We were holding a line that no longer mattered. And the worst part, the part that still tightens my chest when I remember it, is that everything we did was correct, by the book, properly formatted, faithfully executed. The Imperium had not failed us through cruelty. It had simply moved on. Hunger did not arrive like an invasion. It seeped in the way damp seeps into trench walls, slow, inevitable, and so ordinary at first that men tried to pretend it was nothing. We had supplies for weeks, on paper. The ration ledger said so. The stock counts were recorded in neat columns, each crate stamped with the proper codes, each tin sealed with the Emperor's Aquila, pressed into cheap metal. But paper is not food. The first sign was the gap between what the forms promised and what the quartermaster could physically hand out. The supply dockets kept arriving. Clean parchment, fresh ink, blank fields waiting to be filled. Like some distant office was still producing them on schedule. I would receive them in my in-tray each cycle, stamped with the same bureaucratic confidence. Ration allocation request, standard issue, standard issue. As if standard still existed, the quartermaster, a bony man with permanent grime under his nails, would stare at the forms with a kind of exhausted hatred. Then he would look up at me, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness and stress, and ask the same question every time. "How many do you want me to lie by today, clerk?" I used to correct him, tell him to mind his tone, remind him that the forms were sacred, that falsification was a punishable offense. But after the first few cycles of reduced distribution, my mouth stopped forming those words. You cannot punish hunger into obedience. Hunger only makes punishment feel like another rationing method. We began to cut portions. At first, it was by temporary adjustment, logged as operational necessity due to supply chain latency. That is what I wrote, stamping it with the authority of my desk seal. Because authority is not a weapon, it is a tool for making desperation look official. Half a protein bar instead of a full one. A thinner scoop of nutrient paste. Recaf diluted until it tasted like bitter water and machine oil. The men grumbled, but they accepted it. Soldiers can endure almost anything if they are told it is temporary and for the good of the regiment. Discipline is a powerful drug. Then the shipments that were supposed to replenish us simply never appeared. No drop pods, no transport haulers, no blessed crates on grav sleds escorted by sappers. Nothing. The quartermaster stores began to empty in a way that made noise. Crates scraped across stone as they were moved, opened, searched. Men counted tins like misers, each clink of metal against metal sounding too loud in the damp trench air. The smell of food, real food, even if it was factory, pressed and over-salted, became a memory that haunted the dugouts. The ration forms kept coming, blank numbers begging to be filled with lies. That is what broke something in us, the paperwork's indifference. As if the universe itself was still printing expectations, while refusing to provide the reality they described. I would hold the forms over the little stove in the clerk dugout, warming my hands near the flame, and watched the ink shimmer in the heat. It felt like mockery. Officers began arguing like theologians, not about tactics or enemy positions, those had become almost irrelevant, but about entitlement, about how much each company deserved, based on old casualty rates and projected effort, about whether officers should eat first to maintain command efficacy, or whether eating first would provoke mutiny, about whether the chaplain's ration was sacred and thus untouchable, or whether even saints must starve with the flock. I watched a lieutenant and a sergeant nearly come to blows over half a can of recycled paste. They stood in the mud, faces inches apart, shouting with a fury that would have been better spent at the enemy. The can itself sat between them like a relic, dented and dirty, its label long peeled away by moisture. The argument ended only when the commissarial liaison, what remained of his authority, at least, arrived and calmly reminded them that disunity was punishable by death. No one laughed. No one even looked relieved. We had reached the stage where execution was simply another method of resource management. Hunger made discipline sloppy, then brutal. Men stopped cleaning weapons properly because they lacked energy. Watch rotations slipped by minutes, then by hours. Sentries dozed standing up, eyes half-lidded, fingers still on triggers. The officer corps responded with punishments, extra duty, withheld rations, public shaming. Withheld rations. As if anyone had rations to withhold. Punishment became a substitute for nourishment, a way to make someone feel something, fear, pain, humiliation, when the body could no longer be filled. The lash became an event to look forward to, if only because it broke the monotony of empty stomachs. The Medicare logged it all. They recorded weight loss as manageable decline. They noted tremors as fatigue response. They categorized hallucinations, men claiming to smell bread, to taste meat, as stress manifestations. Everything was reduced to clinical language, stamped and filed. Their hands were gentle but detached, the way you handle a tool that might break but must continue working. In the Medica tent, the air smelled of antiseptic and rot. Bandages were reused, boiled and dried. Med stims were rationed more carefully than food. The surgeon once told me quietly, while washing his hands in cold water that was already grey with blood and dirt, hunger kills slower than bullets. But it kills more of you. I wrote that down later, not as a quote, quotes were not permitted, but as a personal note in the margin of a ration report. Then I scratched it out, terrified that someone would see it and interpret it as defeatism. Defeatism is treason, starvation is policy. Men began chewing leather. It started with straps and bootlaces, things already stained with sweat and mud, softened in boiling water until they became vaguely edible. Then it moved to cartridge belts. Then to the waxed prayer strips nailed along trench walls. I watched a soldier peel one off and chew it slowly, eyes closed, as if tasting holiness might fill him. The chaplain saw him and said nothing. Perhaps even the chaplain understood that doctrine cannot fill an empty belly. We prayed over boiled moss, literally. Work parties went out under cover of fog to scrape green growth from crater edges and shell, shattered stones, bringing it back like treasure. We boiled it in dented pots, stirring it into a thin soup that tasted like dirt and bitterness. Before eating, the priest led a blessing, voice trembling, hands raised over the steaming mess. Let it sustain, he whispered. It did not, it merely delayed collapse. Then the first soldier stole a ration chit, not food. There was no food to steal. He stole the paper that represented food. He took it from the quartermaster's desk, in the confusion of distribution. Perhaps he thought the chit could be traded for something. Perhaps he thought the act of stealing would make him feel alive. He was caught quickly. Everything in a starving camp is noticed. Eyes track movement constantly, not out of vigilance for the enemy, but out of suspicion for your neighbor's hands. The tribunal was held that same cycle, in the mud-choked chapel trench. Beneath a tarp sagging under rainwater, the commissarial liaison read out the charge: theft of ration entitlement, undermining of discipline, contamination of morale. The accused stood shaking, hollow-eyed, his uniform hanging looser than it had a week ago. He tried to speak. He tried to explain that he had been hungry, that he hadn't meant anything, that he thought maybe. The commissar shot him before he finished. The bolt pistol's crack echoed off trench walls, louder than any prayer. The man fell face first into mud, blood mixing with rainwater, and for a moment the world went still. Then the commissar turned, wiped his weapon clean with a cloth, and said, "Order is all we have left to eat." I wrote the execution into the report. Cause of death: disciplinary enforcement. Effect on morale: stabilizing. My hand did not shake as much as I wished it had. That night, men did not speak. They sat in silence, staring at their bowls of boiled moss, chewing slowly, eyes empty. Somewhere beyond the trenches, distant gunfire reminded us the war still existed, just not for us. The ration forms arrived again the next cycle, blank numbers waiting to be filled. And I realized with a cold certainty that hunger was not simply our suffering, it was our confirmation. If the Imperium truly remembered us, we would not be starving. Therefore, we were forgotten, and the only thing left to us was the ledger, and the brutal truth that discipline could survive long after bodies could not. I kept transmitting because stopping would have felt like admitting we no longer existed. Every cycle, at the prescribed hour, I sat at the Vox station with its cracked casing and humming coils, the smell of hot dust and ozone filling the cramped dugout. The machine's spirit responded obediently to the rites, indicator lights flickered, auspex needles twitched, and the familiar low thrum settled into a steady rhythm. By every measurable standard, the Vox was functional. That made what followed worse. I sent situation reports with increasing care. I checked formatting twice. I recited the invocation exactly as written, down to the pauses between syllables. I ensured the date stamp reflected the local cycle, even though no two chronometers in the camp agreed anymore. I listed casualties, ration levels, ammunition counts, morale assessments. I asked, politely, professionally, for resupply, reinforcement, clarification. Silence answered. At first I blamed myself. A misplaced code, a corrupted prefix, a prayer mispronounced. The Imperium teaches you early that error is personal, that if something fails, it is because you failed it. I ran diagnostics until my fingers ached, swapping out cables, cleaning contacts with oil-soaked rags, chanting litanies until my throat went raw. Nothing changed. Then, on a cycle I can no longer date with certainty, the Vox answered, not with static, not with garbled noise, with a voice. Transmission received, it said, calm and measured. Stand by for processing. I froze, every hair on my arm stood up. The dugout felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in as if to listen. I remember the exact phrasing because it was perfect, too perfect. The tone was that of an administratum clerk reading from a script, neither hurried nor bored, precisely neutral. I called the officer and the commissarial liaison immediately. They crowded into the dugout, boots sinking into mud, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the Vox grill as if expecting something to crawl out of it. The voice continued, "Please confirm unit designation and operational status." It used outdated codes, obsolete formatting that had been revised cycles years ago, but it used them correctly. When I hesitated, unsure how to respond, the commissar nodded sharply. "Answer," he said. "By the book." So I did. I confirmed our designation, our position, our status. My voice sounded thin in my own ears. When I finished, there was a pause, exactly the length prescribed by protocol for data processing. Then the voice spoke again. "Casualty figures incomplete. Please resubmit with proper categorization." The officer swore under his breath. It asked for casualty numbers the way a clerk requests inventory. No concern, no urgency, just an expectation of compliance. It corrected my terminology when I used a newer classification code, gently suggesting the older version as preferred. My skin crawled. We answered anyway, because disobedience is unthinkable. After that, the replies became frequent, not constant, never predictable, but they came often enough to keep hope alive, which in retrospect feels like another cruelty. Each transmission we sent was acknowledged, sometimes questioned, sometimes returned with annotations, always polite, always wrong. It asked for resupply confirmations we had never received. It referenced campaigns long concluded, or not yet begun. It issued reminders about paperwork, deadlines that made no sense in the context of our situation, yet were formatted with impeccable authority. The more we transmitted, the more the replies improved. It began mirroring our phrasing, adopting our habitual sentence structures. When the chaplain insisted we include devotional affirmations at the end of reports, The replies began echoing them back, altered slightly, as if testing variations. When I abbreviated a phrase out of fatigue, the next response used the same abbreviation. It was learning. I could feel it. The Vox room became a place of dread. Men avoided it unless ordered. Even the commissar lingered less, standing further from the machine, hand resting on his pistol, not with confidence, but with uncertainty. We joked about it at first, nervous laughter, gallows humor. Someone suggested it was a misrouted relay station, an ancient cogitator running on broken routines. But cogitators do not adapt. One cycle, after a particularly grim patrol report, 3 sentries missing, no signs of struggle, I received a reply that made my stomach drop. Losses noted. The voice said, "Please update roster to reflect removals." It used the exact phrasing from our internal ledger. That phrase had never been transmitted. I felt cold spread through my chest as I realized the implication. The Vox was not merely responding to what we sent. It was responding to what we were. To our routines, our records, our prayers muttered under breath. It knew us. The officer ordered a blackout. No more transmissions unless absolutely necessary. The Vox was to remain powered down, sanctified seals applied. The tech adept, what remained of one, at least, performed the rites with shaking hands, daubing holy oil and affixing purity tags that fluttered uselessly in the damp air. For a time, the silence returned, but it was different now. It felt expectant. Men reported hearing whispers near the Vox room at night, voices that sounded like comrades calling their names in administrative tones. Auspex readings spiked inexplicably around the comms equipment, then settled. The chaplain preached harder, louder, insisting this was a test of faith, that the Emperor spoke through many channels. I watched him avoid the Vox room too. Eventually, necessity overruled fear, enemy activity increased, shapes moving closer under cover of darkness, pressure building along the perimeter. We needed confirmation, support, anything. The officer ordered the Vox reactivated. I protested. Quietly, formally I cited irregularities, potential contamination, doctrinal risk. The commissar listened, expression unreadable, then shook his head. "Silence is worse," he said. "Transmit." I powered the machine. Before I could speak, it answered. "Welcome back," the voice said. Not protocol, not standard phrasing. Welcome back. My hands shook as I keyed the transmitter. The reply that followed was flawless. Updated codes, current terminology, even a reference to the execution of the ration thief, framed as disciplinary action acknowledged. I had not transmitted that report. I felt something inside me crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a hairline fracture spreading through bone. It was not command. It was not the Imperium. But it understood the Imperium better than we did. It knew that paperwork is power, that compliance is survival, that if you speak with enough authority, men will obey even as they die. We realized too late that something had been listening from the start, cataloging us, filing us away in whatever ledger it kept. And now that we had drawn its attention, it was unwilling to let us go. The enemy we faced was not on the horizon. It was in the Vox, and it was very good at paperwork. When high command does not arrive, something else always fills the vacuum. In our case, it was doctrine, not the living kind, flexible, argued over, interpreted by men who still believed in outcomes, but the rigid, dead doctrine that exists only in manuals and sermons. The kind that does not ask whether it should be applied, only whether it can be. The officer gathered us beneath the torn canopy that passed for a chapel, mud sucking at our boots, rain tapping a steady, maddening rhythm on canvas and steel. The Vox had been sealed again, purity tags hanging limp and useless, but its presence still felt like a pressure behind the eyes. He spoke loudly, carefully, as if volume could substitute for certainty. "Our situation," he said, "is a test." That word again, test. It was always a test when no one wanted to admit failure. A test of faith, of discipline, of loyalty to the creed. The commissarial liaison stood beside him, bolt pistol visible, polished to a dull shine that caught the grey light. He said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was the punctuation at the end of every sentence. Orders followed, mandatory sermons at the start and end of each cycle, attendance logged, absences investigated, unauthorized speculation classified as morale contamination, rumors defined broadly enough to include questions, doubts, and silence that lasted too long. The war had moved on without us, but regulations had not. The chaplain's voice grew hoarse from constant prayer. He spoke of saints who endured abandonment, of martyrs forgotten by history but remembered by the emperor. He spoke of patience as virtue and suffering as proof. Each sermon ended with the same reminder: despair is heresy. I watched men mouth the words along with him, lips cracked, eyes hollow. Faith had become another ration, distributed evenly, consumed mechanically, offering just enough structure to keep bodies upright. Executions were authorized under a new category: panic contamination. The phrase appeared on an updated enforcement directive, stamped and signed by someone far above us, or long dead. It gave local authority broad discretion. Too broad. Anyone whose fear threatened cohesion could be removed. For the good of the regiment. Fear became evidence. A shaking hand during roll call, a whispered question about resupply, a refusal to chant loudly enough. Each was logged, reviewed, escalated. The commissar took to standing at the edge of assemblies, eyes scanning faces, measuring devotion by volume and posture. I began to dread the sermons more than enemy fire. Men confessed invented sins just to feel seen. I saw it happen again and again. Soldiers stepping forward after prayers, kneeling in the mud, admitting to thoughts they did not truly have, envy, doubt, resentment, because confession meant acknowledgement. Because to be punished was better than to be ignored. The chaplain listened gravely, offering penance that often involved labor, fasting, or public humiliation. Sometimes he deferred to the commissar. Sometimes the bolt pistol answered before absolution could be granted. The paperwork was immaculate, every execution logged, every sanction justified, every bullet accounted for. I wrote the reports with numb precision, my pen carving lines into damp parchment as if etching names onto a tomb. Cause morale preservation, outcome stabilization. The words felt obscene. Every day we held the line mattered less, enemy probes increased. Small testing incursions, shots from the fog, shapes retreating when challenged. It was clear we were being watched, measured, pressured, and yet no new orders came, no tactical updates, no reinforcements. We were enforcing discipline for a war that no longer included us. Punishments escalated, extra duties became impossible tasks. Digging trenches that collapsed faster than they could be reinforced, standing watch for hours without relief, reciting catechisms until voices failed. The goal was no longer correction, it was exhaustion. A tired man does not question. I watched a veteran sergeant, 30 years in service, scars mapping his body like campaign medals, break down during a sermon. He began to laugh, softly at first, then harder, a wet, choking sound that echoed under the tarp. The commissar shot him without hesitation. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of rain hitting a corpse. No one moved. The chaplain finished the prayer, voice trembling only slightly. Attendance was marked complete. That night I could not sleep, not because of guilt. Guilt had become a luxury, but because of the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted. Authority was no longer a means to an end. It was the end. Enforcement for enforcement's sake. Punishment as proof of relevance. We were maintaining order because order was all that connected us to the Imperium. Without it, we would have to admit what we were abandoned. The commissar began issuing directives that contradicted one another. Curfews overlapped with mandatory duties. Silence orders conflicted with required chanting. Compliance became impossible, which meant punishment became inevitable. I realized then that this was not incompetence. It was pressure, a system tightening until something broke. The regiment did not break in battle. There was no glorious last stand, no overwhelming assault that scattered us. We broke under regulations applied without context, under rules meant for a functioning war machine imposed on a forgotten fragment. Men stopped speaking to one another except in approved phrases. Conversations became stilted, cautious, as if every word might be overheard and misinterpreted. Friendships dissolved under suspicion. Survival instincts turned inward. I found myself censoring my own thoughts, rehearsing acceptable reactions before expressing anything at all. Even alone, even in silence, I feared being observed. By the commissar, by the vox, by whatever unseen ledger tracked our compliance. One cycle, while compiling execution records, I noticed something strange. The casualty totals matched our headcount reductions exactly, but the roster had not been updated. Names remained listed as active even after death. When I brought this to the officer's attention, he stared at the ledger for a long time. "Leave it," he said finally. "It's cleaner that way." Cleaner. As if accuracy was a liability, the war outside intensified. We could hear it sometimes, distant bombardments, flashes lighting the clouds far beyond our perimeter. Other battles, other regiments, still mattered. The Imperium still functioned, just not for us. Morale was enforced at gunpoint because there was nothing else left to enforce. Faith had become hollow repetition. Duty had become reflex. Fear was both cause and cure. I understood then that the Imperium had not forgotten us out of negligence. It had forgotten us because forgetting is efficient. And until we were completely erased, by hunger, by execution, by something worse, we would continue to obey, continue to file reports, continue to kill one another in the name of stability, because that is what good soldiers do. They follow orders, even when the orders are all that remains. The first raid did not announce itself with artillery or alarms. It arrived the way rot arrives, quietly, almost politely, slipping past notice until the damage was already done. The sentry on the eastern trench section failed to report at the scheduled interval. That alone was not unusual anymore. Watches slipped. Men nodded off. Fatigue had become endemic. The corporal assigned to check on him grumbled, grabbed his rifle, and climbed the ladder. He did not come back. We found the post an hour later. No blood. No shell impact. No sign of struggle. The rifle was stacked neatly against the trench wall, cleaned. The helmet sat beside it, placed carefully on the firing step. The man's boots were aligned heel to toe, laces tucked in. It looked less like a battlefield position and more like a shrine assembled by someone who had studied us. We blamed deserters first. That was easier. Deserters could be hated, cursed, and rationalized. Hunger drives men to run. Fear makes cowards. We told ourselves that was all it was. The commissar ordered a search party, framing it as a retrieval operation followed by punitive measures. Morale through action. The patrol returned with nothing. No tracks, no disturbance. Auspex scans showed faint residuals, movement without mass, heat without bodies, but the readings were inconsistent, impossible to pin down. The tech adept shook his head, muttering binaric prayers, insisting the instruments were faulty. Then another sentry vanished. Same section, same careful arrangement of equipment. This time, a devotional token had been added, one of our standard issue charms, etched with a prayer I recognized. It had been hanging on the sentry's chest the cycle before. I knew because I had logged its requisition. Panic tried to take root then, but panic had already been classified as contamination. Instead, suspicion spread. Men eyed one another across trench lines, fingers tightening on triggers. Was someone doing this? Was it a cruel joke? A psychological operation? The patrol reports became incoherent. Tracks terminate abruptly. Audio sensors record whispers matching friendly vocal profiles. Visual contact lost without engagement. I compiled them anyway, stitching fragmented observations into something that resembled a report. The Vox remained silent, sealed and waiting, its presence felt even when unpowered. I did not transmit these reports. I could not bring myself to feed whatever was listening. The raids continued, always at night, always without noise, always precise. Men disappeared between duty shifts. A trooper would answer roll call in the evening and be gone by morning, his bunk empty, his kit arranged as if prepared for inspection. There were no screams, no shots, no alarms triggered. It was as if they had simply stepped out of existence. We stopped calling them deaths. We called them removals, because death implies violence. This felt administrative. The officer ordered tighter patrols, overlapping watches, increased lighting. Flood lamps illuminated the no man's land in harsh white glare, casting long shadows that twisted with every flicker. Nothing approached the wire. Nothing moved, and yet every cycle someone was gone. The worst part was the paperwork. Every loss required documentation: name, rank, cause of casualty, location, circumstances. The forms demanded specificity we did not possess. Enemy action felt like a lie. Unknown was unacceptable. The commissar insisted on precision. If we don't name the cause, he said, we invite speculation. So we invented categories. Presumed hostile infiltration, probable abduction, operational disappearance. Each phrase felt like a theft, not of life, but of truth. I hated writing, cause of casualty, more than anything else. My pen would hover over the line, ink threatening to blot, while I tried to decide which lie was least insulting. These men deserved better than euphemism. They deserved acknowledgement. But acknowledgement required a name for the enemy, and there was no name. The uniforms we found folded unnerved me most. They were clean, mud brushed off, buttons fastened, insignia straightened. Once we found a jacket laid across a crate, sleeves folded inward, a prayer strip tucked carefully into the breast pocket. It was reverent, almost affectionate. Someone, or something, had taken the time. I began to suspect that the enemy was watching us not as prey, but as a system, studying routines, learning rituals, understanding what we valued, what we feared. The Vox, sealed and silent, loomed in my thoughts. I could not shake the feeling that whatever answered us before had not stopped listening. One night, while reviewing patrol logs by flickering lumen light, I heard my name spoken softly from the trench outside. My name, spoken in my own voice. I froze, every muscle locked. The sound was close, just beyond the dugout entrance. Calm, familiar. As if I had spoken to myself without realizing it, I did not answer. After a long moment, the voice repeated the name, this time slightly wrong. The cadence was off. The emphasis misplaced, like a clerk mispronouncing an unfamiliar designation. Then it stopped. I told no one. If I logged it, it would become real. If I spoke it aloud, it would invite attention. Silence had become my last defense. We were fighting an enemy the official maps refused to acknowledge. Recon picts showed nothing. Auspex returns contradicted one another. The chaplain insisted these were trials sent to test our faith. The commissar suspected psychological warfare. The officer pretended this was still manageable, but every loss felt like theft rather than death. There were no bodies to mourn, no wounds to dress, no final words, just absence. And absence, I learned, is harder to endure than carnage. Men began sleeping in groups, backs pressed together, weapons clutched even in dreams. Some refused to sleep at all, eyes red-rimmed, twitching at every sound. Others prayed constantly, whispering litanies under their breath until their voices broke. Nothing helped. The enemy did not strike camps or supply lines. It struck records. One cycle, a trooper vanished, and when I went to update the ledger, his name was already smudged, half erased, as if the page itself had rejected him. I stared at it, heart pounding, and tried to remember exactly how his name had been spelled. I couldn't. That terrified me more than the raids. We were being dismantled quietly, piece by piece, with care and attention to detail that suggested intention, purpose, perhaps even enjoyment. And through it all, the Imperium remained silent. No warnings, no alerts, no acknowledgement that this enemy existed, which meant one of two things. Either command did not know, or command did not want to know. The paperwork piled up, growing heavier, more desperate. I filled form after form, each one an admission of ignorance disguised as authority. Cause of casualty became a line I dreaded, because every time I wrote something there, I felt like I was lying to the dead. We were still holding the line, but the line was no longer against an enemy with guns and banners. It was against erasure, and we were losing. The order arrived without ceremony. No warning chime, no coded preface, no acknowledgement of the months we had endured without reply. It simply appeared in the incoming tray 1 cycle, printed on thin, official parchment that smelled faintly of machine oil and incense. The ink was fresh, the seal was intact, the authority unquestionable. For a long moment, no one touched it. We gathered around the desk like mourners around a body, staring at the document as if it might change under scrutiny. I was the one who finally picked it up, because that was my duty. Because someone had to read it aloud. It reassigned us, not to a relief position, not to extraction, not even to a desperate counteroffensive. We were reassigned to a front line that no longer existed. The coordinates were precise, grid references, elevation data, logistical routing, but they pointed into dead ground. I recognized the region from old campaign maps. A stretch of blasted territory abandoned cycles ago after orbital bombardment rendered it strategically irrelevant. No supply routes, no command posts, no friendly units within any reasonable distance, a place where nothing lived. The order was stamped, signed and countersigned. Multiple layers of approval, no ambiguity, no margin for interpretation. Command demands compliance, the officer said quietly after I finished reading. His face was drawn, eyes sunken, uniform hanging loose on his frame. The order is real, but the destination isn't, someone whispered. No one argued. Arguing would have implied choice. The commissar examined the document with a care usually reserved for sacred texts. He traced the seal with one finger, nodding slowly, as if reassured by its weight. Orders are orders, he said. Whether they make sense is irrelevant. That sentence settled over us like ash. We prepared to move. Preparation at that stage was mostly ritual. We inventoried what little ammunition remained, recording numbers that looked absurdly small on the forms. We logged rations we did not have. We checked weapons that were worn down to the point of unreliability, machine spirits sulking from neglect and overuse. The banners were raised, tattered cloth, faded insignia, holes stitched closed with mismatched thread, symbols of regimental identity that meant less with every passing cycle. Still, they were carried, because doctrine demanded it. The march began at dawn, if that word still applied under a sky permanently bruised by smoke and dust. We moved through trenches we had occupied for so long they felt like extensions of our bodies. I glanced back once, unable to help myself, and felt a strange ache at the sight of them receding. They had been hell. They had been home. Now they were being left behind without ceremony, just another position abandoned without explanation. The land ahead was wrong, not hostile in the way battlefields usually are, no gunfire, no movement, but empty in a way that set teeth on edge. The ground was churned into grey slurry, cratered and uneven, littered with half-buried debris from a war fought long before we arrived. The air tasted metallic, dry, carrying no familiar sense of life or decay. Even the wind felt hesitant. We marched on half legs and hollow stomachs. Men stumbled, boots slipping on loose ash. Those who fell were hauled upright by comrades until there were no comrades left to haul them. No one complained. Complaints required energy we no longer had. Guns were dragged rather than carried. Heavy weapons teams moved like ghosts, eyes unfocused, muscles trembling with every step. Shells clinked weakly in crates that were nearly empty, each sound a reminder of how little we had left. I kept the order folded in my pocket. I could feel it there with every step, a physical reminder that this march was not a mistake. It was sanctioned, approved, logged. That made it worse. We reached the coordinates by nightfall. There was nothing there, no fortifications, no trenches, no signs of recent occupation. Just a wide expanse of broken ground under a sky that seemed too vast, too indifferent. The Auspex returned nonsense readings, distances that did not correspond to reality, energy fluctuations without sources. This is the front line, the officer said quietly. No one laughed. We set up camp out of habit, not expectation. Defensive perimeters marked on maps no one believed in. Sentries posted at intervals that made sense only on paper. I logged our arrival time, stamping the report with hands that felt detached from my body. Arrival acknowledged by no one. That was when understanding finally settled in, not as panic, not as despair, but as something colder and clearer. Being forgotten had not been an accident. It had been a process. First silence, then deprivation, then pressure, then erasure. Each step logged, justified, approved somewhere far beyond our reach. No single decision had doomed us. 1,000 small ones had, each made by someone who never saw our faces. This reassignment was the final step. We were being disposed of administratively. No need for executions. No need for inquiries. Just a unit quietly moved to a location where survival was statistically improbable, and therefore no longer required attention. Acceptable attrition. The commissar knew it too. I saw it in the way his grip tightened on his pistol, not with authority but with something like anger. Or perhaps fear. He said nothing. Issued no speeches, no sermons. Even doctrine had limits, and we were pressing against them. That night, something followed us into the dead ground. Not openly, not aggressively. Just a sense of presence at the edge of perception. Shapes that did not resolve when looked at directly. Footsteps heard a second too late. Whispers that stopped when challenged. The enemy we were not told about had not stayed behind. It never did. I tried to update the roster. The ledger resisted. Names smeared under my pen, ink spreading in strange patterns, letters refusing to hold shape. I wiped the nib, tried again, pressing harder until the parchment threatened to tear. Still, the names would not stay. It was as if the book itself knew the truth. We no longer belonged anywhere. Orders arrived only once more, a brief confirmation of receipt, a reminder to maintain discipline, no mention of resupply, no mention of extraction, no mention of support, just a directive to continue operations. Operations toward what end, I could not say. As the cycles passed, movement slowed, losses mounted. Men disappeared even more frequently now, vanishing into the dead ground with no uniforms left behind this time. There was no need for ritual anymore. We had been acknowledged one final time, just long enough to be reassigned into oblivion. I stopped expecting rescue. Hope requires an address. We had none. All that remained was duty, stripped of purpose, carried out because it was the only shape life still took. March. Hold. Report. Obey. The Imperium had not killed us. It had simply stopped needing us. And that, I learned, is how most wars truly end. The ledger began changing before I noticed it was wrong. At first, I blamed exhaustion. Hunger had hollowed us out, sleep had become a rumor, and the dead ground played tricks on perception. Ink bled strangely here, paper warped. Cogitator screens flickered even when powered down. It was easy to assume the problem was me. But the ledger did not behave like damaged equipment. It behaved like something making decisions. I discovered it during a routine roll call update, if routine was still a word that applied. 3 men had vanished during the previous watch. No alarms, no witnesses. Just absence as clean and complete as a clerical deletion. I opened the roster to mark their status, pen poised, already composing the language of loss in my head. Their names were gone. Not crossed out. Not marked inactive. Gone. Where there should have been neat lines of script, there was blank parchment, slightly darker than the surrounding page, as if the names had been erased so thoroughly the paper remembered their removal. I ran my fingers over it, feeling for indentations, for scars left by ink pressed too hard. Nothing. My mouth went dry. I checked the previous pages. The names appeared there, earlier entries, duty rotations, ration allocations still intact. But the current roster, the active list, had changed without human hands. The ledger had decided these men no longer qualified for presence. I tried to write them back in. I copied the names carefully from older entries, matching the script exactly. As soon as the ink touched the page, it spread unnaturally, feathering outward, blurring letters into meaningless shapes. Within seconds, the words faded, leaving only stains like bruises beneath the parchment surface. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. This was not erasure after death. This was erasure as death. Men would speak to me in the morning, ask about watch rotations, complain about boots falling apart, mutter prayers they barely believed in anymore, and by nightfall their names would resist inscription, not removed by order, not struck by decree, simply consumed. Roll call became a ritual of dread. We stood in loose formation under a sky that never changed, calling out designations that echoed back strangely, swallowed by distance or repeated a half-second too late. Sometimes a name would be answered by the wrong voice. Sometimes no voice at all. The officer adjusted counts manually, refusing to look at the ledger, insisting on human confirmation. It did not matter. By the next cycle, the numbers would no longer match. The commissarial office noticed. They always do. I was summoned to the command tent. What remained of it, canvas patched and repatched, its interior smelling of damp paper and gun oil. The commissar stood behind the desk, ledger open before him, gloved finger tapping the blank spaces. Explain, he said. I tried. I described the smearing ink, the resistance, the way names refused to persist. I chose my words carefully, framing it as equipment failure, environmental contamination, possible warp interference. I avoided saying what I truly thought, that the regiment was being eaten alive by its own records. The commissar listened in silence. Then he closed the ledger. Tampering with official documents is a capital offense, he said calmly. I am not tampering, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I am trying to preserve accuracy. He stared at me for a long moment, eyes unreadable. Accuracy, he said slowly, is defined by authority. He ordered me to stop making manual corrections. From that cycle onward, The ledger was to be considered self-updating, its contents accepted as authoritative. Any discrepancies between physical presence and recorded data were to be resolved in favor of the record. I understood the implication immediately. If the ledger said a man was gone, then he was gone, whether his body still stood before us or not. That night, I watched it happen. A trooper, designation I still remember, because memory was all I had left, stood watch beside me as I updated patrol schedules. He spoke quietly about his sister, about a farm world he barely remembered, about how he wondered whether anyone back home would know if he died here. I nodded, said nothing. When I looked back down at the ledger, his name had begun to blur, not erased yet. Just softening, as if the ink was sinking into the page. I reached out instinctively, touching the parchment, and felt a faint vibration beneath my fingertips. Like a machine cycling. Like a stomach digesting. I looked up. He was still there, still talking. I told him to stop. He frowned, confused. Stop what? Talking, I said. Just be quiet, as if silence might protect him. When I looked down again, the name was gone. I raised my eyes slowly. The space beside me was empty, no sound, no movement, no sign he had ever been there. His rifle lay on the ground, carefully placed, cleaned. His helmet rested atop it, devotional charm tucked neatly inside. I did not scream, I did not pray. I closed the ledger. From that moment on, I stopped trying to fight it. What could I do against a system that devoured existence itself and called it bookkeeping? The Imperium teaches that if something is not recorded, it does not exist. Now I understood the inverse truth. If something is removed from the record, it ceases to be real. Men began to sense it. They avoided giving names. They stopped speaking about their pasts. They referred to one another by role, sentry, loader, runner, as if anonymity might buy time. Some scratched their names into armor plates, into skin, into the dirt, desperate to anchor themselves somewhere. It did not help. The ledger did not care about identity. It cared about relevance. The commissar's authority eroded alongside the roster. He executed fewer men, not out of mercy, but because execution requires acknowledgement. You must name someone to kill them. Increasingly, there were fewer names to work with. The chaplain stopped preaching, not officially. He still led prayers, still recited litanies, but his eyes were empty, unfocused. Once, I saw him stare at the roster for a long time, lips moving silently, as if trying to remember a name he knew had been there. The officer asked me one cycle, how many men we had left. I could not answer. The ledger said one number. My eyes said another. My memory said something else entirely. None of them agreed. That was when the true horror settled in. We were not dying. We were being deleted, one by one, quietly, efficiently, without the messiness of battle or the drama of last stands. Our suffering was not meant to be witnessed. It was meant to be resolved. I stopped updating the ledger eventually. Not as rebellion. Rebellion implies hope, but as surrender. There was no point arguing with a book that knew better than I did whether someone deserved to remain. I still carry it. The ledger is lighter now. Thinner, many pages blank, many others stained with ink, ghosts where names once were. Sometimes, when I open it, I see my own designation still intact, stubbornly resisting erasure. For now, I know what will happen eventually. One cycle, I will open the ledger and find that my line has softened, that my name no longer holds, that the book has decided my usefulness has expired. When that happens, there will be no sound, no one will notice, and the Imperium's records will remain perfectly balanced. The end did not come like an ending. There was no last stand, no crescendo of gunfire, no moment where the sky split open and judgment descended in fire. The Imperium does not waste drama on things it has already resolved. Our end arrived the way all final decisions arrive in the administratum, quietly, conclusively, and without appeal. The notice appeared in the ledger one cycle without announcement. I did not hear it arrive. I did not feel anything change in the air. I simply opened the book, as I had done every cycle out of habit rather than purpose, and saw the entry already there. Fresh ink, clean lines. Perfectly aligned status, losses within acceptable margins, unit disposition concluded, further action none required. I stared at those words for a long time. They were not addressed to us. They were not even about us in any meaningful sense. They were a resolution note, something meant to tidy a file, to close a case, to free a clerk's attention for the next problem waiting in line. Our suffering had been summarized into a phrase so small it barely took up space on the page: acceptable attrition. I looked up from the ledger, expecting, foolishly, to see something different, to feel something different. But the dead ground remained the same, ash drifting on a wind that smelled faintly of ozone and nothing else. The sky unmoved, the silence unbroken. A few figures still stood nearby, not many. I did not know how many anymore. They gathered out of instinct when I called them, not by name, but by voice alone. We stood in a loose formation, boots sinking slightly into the churned soil, weapons held more out of habit than readiness. No one spoke. No one asked questions. Somewhere along the way, questions had lost their meaning. I told them what the ledger said, not the exact wording. I did not read it aloud. There was no need. They understood from my tone, from the way my hands trembled slightly as I closed the book, from the way I did not look at the horizon anymore, because there was nothing left to expect from it. The Imperium was done with us. We had not failed. We had not succeeded. We had been processed. One of the men, if he was still a man by the ledger's standards, laughed softly, not hysterical laughter, just a short, breathless sound like air escaping a punctured lung. "So that's it," he said. No one answered. We stood there for a long time after that, as if waiting for further instruction. Formation is hard to abandon when it has been drilled into you since conscription. Even now, even here, posture felt safer than freedom. Eventually, I dismissed them. There was no order for it. I simply said, "You're dismissed," and they nodded, some saluting out of reflex, others just turning away and walking off into the grey expanse. I do not know what happened to them after that. I did not record it. The ledger did not ask. I returned to the clerk's table, nothing more than a crate balanced on rubble, and opened the book one last time. My own designation still appeared on the active list. Clean, unsmudged, resistant, operational. I understood then why. Someone had to remain to close the file. That had always been my role. I made my final entry carefully, hands steady despite everything. I recorded the unit's status exactly as instructed. I stamped the page with the regimental seal, pressing hard enough that the impression bit deep into the parchment. The sound of it echoed louder than any gunshot I remembered. When I finished, the ledger felt satisfied. The weight in the air lessened slightly. The sense of being watched receded, as if some immense attention had shifted elsewhere. The enemy we were never told about no longer lingered at the edges of perception. There was nothing left to observe. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind move through broken terrain, carrying ash into my mouth, my eyes, my lungs. It tasted of old battles and forgotten names, of places no longer marked on any map. I thought about home, not a specific place, but the idea of one. I realized I could no longer remember it clearly. Memory fades when it has no reinforcement. When no one else remembers with you. Eventually, I stood. I straightened my uniform as best I could. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, checked its charge pack out of habit, though there was nothing left to shoot. I looked at the ledger one final time, then closed it and placed it carefully atop the crate. I did not take it with me. The book had finished its work. As I walked away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace. Peace implies rest. This was resignation so complete it felt almost gentle. I understood now that death was not the Imperium's preferred method of resolution. Survival, endlessly recorded, endlessly useful, endlessly expendable. That was the true sentence. I do not know how long I walked. Time had lost meaning long before that. But I know this somewhere. In some vast archive of humanity's endless war, a file now sits closed. Our regiment's designation will never be requested again. Our absence will not be questioned. The numbers will balance. The margins will remain acceptable. And if anyone ever searches for us, if anyone ever wonders what became of that unit assigned to a front line that did not exist, they will find only a clean notation. No bodies, no graves, no names. Just a line that says the matter was resolved. This is my confession. When your regiment is accidentally forgotten, the Imperium does not mourn. It does not rage. It does not even notice. You simply become a missing number that keeps the ledger clean.